In the depths of a concrete bunker, 50 feet beneath the ruins of Berlin, the most feared man in the world was about to face his final moments. The date was April 30th, 1945. Outside, Soviet tanks rolled through the streets of the German capital. Inside the Führerbunker, a desperate dictator was making his last preparations as his 1,000-year Reich crumbled around him in just 12 years. What happened in those final chaotic hours? How did the man who once commanded the loyalty of millions spend his last day on Earth? The answers lie in the testimonies of those who were there, in that underground tomb, as history's most destructive regime breathed its last breath. By April 29, 1945, the Führerbunker had transformed from a command center into something resembling a medieval fortress under siege. The massive concrete structure, built 25 feet underground with walls 8 feet thick, had become the last refuge of Nazi leadership. But even these fortifications couldn't keep out the sound of Soviet artillery growing closer by the hour. The bunker's inhabitants lived in a strange twilight world. Electric lighting hummed constantly as no natural light penetrated the depths. The air recycling systems worked overtime, but couldn't completely eliminate the smell of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and fear. Water had to be rationed, and the constant vibration from explosions above made sleeping nearly impossible. Hitler himself had aged dramatically in recent months. Those who knew him before the war described a man barely recognizable. His left hand shook uncontrollably, his posture was stooped, and his famous piercing gaze had become unfocused and distant. The medication cocktail provided by his personal physician had taken its toll, leaving him alternating between manic energy and profound exhaustion. The bunker's population had dwindled to about 40 people by late April. Among them were his longtime companion Eva Braun, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, with his wife and 6 children, his personal secretary Traudl Junge, bodyguard Rokas Misch, and various other staff members. Each person trapped in this underground world knew that capture by the Soviets would likely mean death or worse. Communication with the outside world became increasingly sporadic. Radio messages from German units reported desperate situations across the front. The news was uniformly grim. German defenses were collapsing, commanders were surrendering, and civilian populations were fleeing westward ahead of the advancing Red Army. But what was about to unfold in the next 24 hours would seal not just Hitler's fate, but fundamentally alter the course of world history. In one of history's most surreal moments, April 29th witnessed a wedding ceremony in the bunker's conference room. Hitler and Eva Braun, after 16 years together, finally married in a brief civil ceremony conducted by a city official who had been summoned through the battle lines. Eva Braun had arrived at the bunker in mid-April, against Hitler's explicit wishes. She had traveled from Bavaria, determined to be with him at the end. Her presence provided one of the few sources of normalcy in those final days, as she attempted to maintain social routines and encourage others to keep up appearances. The wedding ceremony itself lasted only minutes. A Nazi official performed the civil rites while artillery shells exploded overhead. The bride wore a dark blue dress, one of the few formal outfits available in the bunker. There were no flowers, no music, no celebration. Instead, the small group of witnesses understood they were participating in what amounted to a funeral ritual. After the ceremony, the newlyweds retired to Hitler's private study, where they dictated their final testaments. These documents would later provide crucial insights into his mental state during those final hours. In his political testament, he showed no remorse for the war's devastation, instead blaming others for the conflict and its consequences. Meanwhile, the military situation continued to deteriorate. Reports reached the bunker that Berlin's defenders had perhaps 48 hours of ammunition remaining. Soviet forces were now fighting street by street through the government district, less than a mile from the bunker entrance. The wedding guests attempted a modest celebration with champagne and sandwiches, but the mood remained somber. Everyone present understood they were witnessing the end of an era, though few could have imagined how completely the Nazi regime would be erased from existence. As the night wore on, discussions turned increasingly to escape plans and final preparations. Some bunker inhabitants still harbored hopes of breaking through Soviet lines, while others had already accepted that death was the only remaining option. April 30th began with particularly heavy bombardment. The Soviet artillery had moved close enough that individual shell impacts could be distinguished, and the bunker's concrete walls transmitted each explosion as a physical shock. Sleep had become impossible for most inhabitants, and many spent the early morning hours in a state of exhausted anxiety. The bunker's generator had been struggling for days, causing the lights to flicker intermittently and plunging sections of the complex into darkness. The ventilation system, damaged by nearby explosions, could no longer filter out the acrid smoke that seeped down from the burning city above. Every breath carried the taste of destruction, burning wood, melted metal, and something far worse that no one wanted to identify. Hitler's daily routine, which had provided structure even in the bunker's chaos, began to break down completely. His usual late-morning awakening gave way to sporadic periods of consciousness. When he did appear, his behavior alternated between frantic activity and complete withdrawal. His personal physician had noticed a significant deterioration in his condition over the past week. The tremor in his left hand had worsened, his speech had become increasingly slurred, and his famous intense stare had given way to a vacant, unfocused gaze. The morning brought a series of devastating reports that arrived through the bunker's failing communication systems. Radio operators, working with equipment that sparked and hissed with each nearby explosion, managed to maintain contact with a handful of German units still fighting in Berlin. Each transmission brought worse news than the last. The Reichstag building, symbol of German government, was under direct assault by Soviet forces. The Brandenburg Gate had fallen. German ammunition supplies were nearly exhausted. The military briefings that had dominated bunker life became increasingly meaningless. Reports from the front were either non-existent or too devastating to acknowledge. The few remaining German units in Berlin were fighting house-to-house battles, buying time measured in hours rather than days. Wehrmacht generals, who had once commanded millions of troops across a continent-spanning empire, now found themselves coordinating the defense of individual city blocks with handfuls of soldiers. One particularly grim report detailed the fate of German civilians caught in the final battle. Thousands of people had taken shelter in subway tunnels and basement shelters throughout the city, only to find themselves trapped between advancing Soviet forces and retreating German troops. The breakdown of military discipline had led to chaos in the streets, with some German soldiers abandoning their posts while others fought with desperate fury, knowing that capture likely meant death. The bunker's telephone system, connected to the outside world through buried cables, brought news from other parts of Germany that painted an equally hopeless picture. Hamburg had surrendered without a fight. Munich was in American hands. The industrial Ruhr Valley had been occupied for weeks. Even the Alpine regions where some Nazi leaders had hoped to make a final stand were being overrun by Allied forces. One of the most disturbing aspects of that final morning was the presence of the Goebbels children in the bunker. The 6 young people, ranging in age from 4 to 12, had been brought to the bunker by their parents, who had decided the family would not survive the fall of the Reich. Their laughter and games provided a haunting counterpoint to the adult discussions of death and defeat. The children had adapted to bunker life with the resilience of youth, treating the underground complex as an adventure and remaining largely unaware of the desperate situation unfolding around them. Helga, the eldest at 12, had begun to sense the gravity of their situation and asked increasingly difficult questions about when they would return home. Her mother, Magda Goebbels, struggled to maintain a cheerful facade while privately grappling with the impossible decision she and her husband had already made regarding their children's fate. Hitler's personal staff began making their own preparations for the end. Documents were being burned in the bunker's courtyard, creating a constant stream of smoke that mixed with the haze from the burning city above. Years of correspondence, military plans, and administrative records were fed into improvised fires, sending the paperwork of the Nazi regime up in flames. Personal belongings were sorted, with many items being destroyed to prevent them from falling into enemy hands and becoming trophies for the victorious Soviets. The bunker's kitchen staff faced their own grim reality as food supplies dwindled to almost nothing. The last delivery of provisions had arrived more than a week earlier, and now they were rationing the remaining canned goods and dried bread. Water, pumped from Berlin's municipal system, had begun to taste of chemicals and debris, reflecting the damage to the city's infrastructure above. Hitler's secretary, Traudl Junge, spent the morning hours typing what she sensed would be her final documents in Nazi service. The mechanical rhythm of her typewriter provided a strange comfort amid the chaos, giving her something familiar to focus on as the world collapsed around her. She had already begun mentally preparing for capture, wondering what fate awaited those who had served at the highest levels of the Nazi hierarchy. The dictator himself spent much of the morning in his private quarters with Eva. Witnesses reported hearing intense conversations, though the specific content remained private. What we do know is that both had already decided their course of action, and the morning hours were spent in final preparations rather than deliberation. Eva had written letters to her family in Bavaria, while Hitler had completed his political testament the previous evening. During brief appearances in the bunker's common areas, Hitler seemed like a man already detached from the physical world. Staff members who had worked with him for years described his movements as mechanical, as if he were going through familiar motions, without any real engagement. His famous charisma, which had once commanded the attention of massive crowds, had completely disappeared, leaving behind a hollow figure shuffling through underground corridors. The morning also brought news of additional betrayals by high-ranking Nazi officials. Reports filtered in that other party leaders were attempting to negotiate separate surrenders with Allied forces, abandoning the regime they had sworn to defend to the death. Each revelation of treachery seemed to drain more life from Hitler's already weakened frame. As noon approached, the sound of small arms fire could be heard even through the bunker's thick walls. Soviet infantry had penetrated the government district and were engaging the last German defenders in close combat. Machine gun fire echoed through the empty streets above, punctuated by the occasional explosion of a hand grenade or artillery shell. The end was now measured in hours, not days. The psychological pressure on the bunker's inhabitants had reached unbearable levels. Some staff members had begun showing signs of complete mental breakdown, sitting motionless for hours, or talking to themselves in hushed whispers. Others maintained a frantic level of activity, cleaning and organizing spaces that would soon be overrun by enemy forces. The normal social hierarchies that had structured bunker life were dissolving as everyone faced the same terrible fate. What would unfold in the afternoon hours would finally bring this nightmare to its inevitable conclusion. The early afternoon of April 30th brought news that would make Hitler's decision final and irreversible. Reports reached the bunker that Heinrich Himmler, one of his most trusted lieutenants and architect of the SS, had been attempting to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies through Swedish intermediaries. This news struck Hitler with devastating force. If Himmler, the man he had entrusted with implementing his most extreme policies, had betrayed him, then the entire Nazi structure had collapsed from within. The revelation seemed to drain whatever remaining energy he possessed, and witnesses described him as appearing physically smaller after receiving the news. The betrayal by Himmler followed similar revelations about other high-ranking Nazis attempting to save themselves through negotiation or flight. Hermann Göring had already been stripped of his positions for suggesting peace negotiations, and now Himmler's treachery completed Hitler's sense of abandonment by those he had considered most loyal. Around 2:30 p.m., Hitler summoned his remaining staff to the bunker's conference room for what would be his final official meeting. The gathering included about 20 people, secretaries, bodyguards, adjutants, and other personnel who had remained loyal to the end. The atmosphere was heavy with unspoken understanding. During this meeting, Hitler distributed cyanide capsules to those present, explaining that he had obtained them through Heinrich Himmler before learning of his betrayal. He instructed everyone to use them if capture appeared imminent, as he believed the Soviets would torture prisoners for propaganda purposes. The dictator then retreated to his private study with Eva. They remained there for approximately 2 hours, during which time the bunker's inhabitants waited in anxious silence. The only sounds were the distant explosions and the mechanical hum of the ventilation system. Around 3:30 p.m., Hitler emerged briefly to receive a final military briefing. The news was uniformly catastrophic. Berlin's remaining defenders were running out of ammunition. Soviet forces had captured most government buildings, and organized resistance would collapse within hours. What happened next would bring one of history's darkest chapters to its conclusion. At approximately 3:30 p.m. on April 30th, 1945, Hitler and Eva retired to his private study for the last time. What occurred in that room over the next 30 minutes can only be reconstructed from physical evidence and the immediate aftermath, as witnessed by those who entered shortly after. The study itself was spartanly furnished: a desk, 2 chairs, a small sofa, and portraits of Frederick the Great and his parents on the walls. Hitler had spent countless hours in this room during the final months, planning military operations that existed only on paper, and issuing orders to units that had long since ceased to exist. Outside the study door, the remaining bunker inhabitants waited in terrible silence. Joseph Goebbels paced the corridors, while his wife Magda sat motionless in the conference room. The staff members who had served Hitler for years found themselves unable to concentrate on any task, instead listening for sounds from behind the heavy door. Around 4 p.m., Hitler's valet, Heinz Linge, detected what he later described as the smell of gunpowder seeping from under the study door. This was followed by an extended period of complete silence from within the room. After waiting several more minutes, the valet knocked softly on the door, receiving no response. When they finally entered the study, the scene inside brought the Nazi era to its definitive end. The physical evidence told a clear story. Hitler had taken his own life with his personal pistol, while Eva had used the cyanide capsule. Both bodies were found on the blue sofa where they had been sitting. The discovery triggered immediate action among the surviving bunker inhabitants. Following Hitler's explicit instructions, his bodyguard and valet wrapped both bodies in blankets and carried them through the bunker's corridors to the emergency exit that led to the Chancellery garden above. The garden itself presented a scene of apocalyptic destruction. Shell craters pocked the ground, debris from the ruined Chancellery building was scattered everywhere, and smoke from fires throughout Berlin created an orange haze that blocked out the sun. Soviet artillery continued to fall randomly across the area, making the cremation ceremony extremely dangerous. Using gasoline stored in the bunker, Hitler's loyal staff attempted to cremate both bodies in the garden. However, the constant artillery bombardment made it impossible to conduct a complete cremation. The remains were hastily buried in a shell crater and covered with dirt and debris. With Hitler's death, the Führerbunker's reason for existence vanished instantly. However, the remaining inhabitants faced the immediate challenge of surviving the next few hours as Soviet forces closed in on their location. The building above them was already partially occupied by Red Army troops, and discovery was inevitable. Joseph Goebbels, as the highest-ranking Nazi official remaining, assumed nominal leadership of the bunker. However, his authority was largely meaningless, as there was no longer any government to lead or army to command. His primary concern had shifted to the fate of his own family, particularly his 6 children. The propaganda minister spent the evening of April 30th composing his own final testament. Unlike Hitler's document, which blamed others for Germany's defeat, Goebbels' statement acknowledged that the Nazi experiment had failed completely. He expressed his intention to follow his leader's example rather than face capture and trial. Meanwhile, other bunker inhabitants made desperate plans for escape. Some hoped to blend in with Berlin's civilian population, while others planned to attempt breaking through Soviet lines to reach American or British forces in Western Germany. These plans were largely futile, as the Soviets had sealed off all escape routes from the city center. The children, unaware of the full gravity of their situation, continued to play games and ask innocent questions about when they could go home. Their presence added an additional layer of tragedy to the bunker's final hours, as the adults around them struggled with impossible decisions about the family's fate. Communication equipment in the bunker continued to function sporadically, bringing news of Germany's complete military collapse. Reports indicated that German forces throughout Europe were surrendering en masse, and that the provisional government established after Hitler's death was preparing to capitulate unconditionally. As night fell on April 30th, the sound of Soviet voices could be heard in the Chancellery building directly above the bunker. Combat engineers were systematically searching the ruins for any remaining German resistance, and it was only a matter of time before they discovered the bunker entrance. May 1st dawned with Soviet forces in complete control of the government district. The few remaining German defenders had either fled, surrendered, or been eliminated during the night. Red Army engineers began a systematic exploration of the underground facilities beneath the ruined Chancellery building. The Goebbels family tragedy unfolded that evening, as the propaganda minister and his wife made their final decision regarding their children's fate. Unable to imagine life after the Nazi defeat, they chose to end their family's existence rather than face an uncertain future under Soviet occupation. The details of this tragedy remain among the most disturbing aspects of the bunker's final hours. Soviet troops discovered the bunker entrance on May 2nd and began a careful exploration of the underground complex. They found a scene of complete abandonment, scattered documents, personal belongings, and evidence of hasty departure. The discovery of the conference room, private quarters, and communication center provided the Soviets with valuable intelligence about Nazi leadership during the final weeks. The search for Hitler's remains became an immediate priority for Soviet intelligence. The hastily conducted cremation in the Chancellery garden had been incomplete, leaving physical evidence that Soviet investigators would eventually uncover. However, Stalin chose to keep the discovery secret for strategic reasons, allowing speculation about Hitler's fate to continue for years. Some bunker inhabitants successfully escaped during the chaotic final hours. Hitler's secretary Traudl Junge managed to reach American lines and later provided detailed testimony about the bunker's final days. Her account, along with those of other survivors, formed the basis for our historical understanding of these events. The bodyguard Rokas Mish was captured by Soviet forces and spent years in prison camps before returning to Germany. His testimony, recorded decades later, provided additional details about the daily routine in the bunker and Hitler's behavior during the final weeks. The physical bunker itself was systematically destroyed by Soviet engineers over the following months. The concrete structure that had housed Nazi leadership during its final days was demolished, and the site was eventually incorporated into East Berlin's urban development, erasing most physical traces of these historic events. The death of Adolf Hitler in that underground bunker marked more than just the end of one man's life. It represented the complete collapse of a regime that had promised to last 1,000 years, but survived barely 12. The Nazi experiment, which had brought unprecedented destruction to Europe and the world, finally ended in a scene of personal defeat and institutional failure. The contrast between Nazi propaganda and reality had never been starker than in those final bunker days. The regime that had glorified strength, will, and racial superiority ended with its leaders hiding underground, betraying each other, and choosing death over facing the consequences of their actions. For the millions of victims of Nazi persecution, Hitler's death provided a form of justice, though it could never restore what had been lost. While the death of Adolf Hitler was marked by fear and desperation, the fate of those who opposed him was far worse. Hitler's path to power didn't begin with concentration camps and mass elimination. It started with something far more insidious, a carefully orchestrated campaign of intimidation and political maneuvering. In the early 1920s, as the Nazi Party was still in its infancy, Hitler recognized the power of controlled violence. The Sturmabteilung, or SA, better known as the Brown Shirts, became his tool for disrupting political meetings of opponents. These weren't random acts of violence, but calculated displays meant to create fear and confusion. Communist and social democratic gatherings would suddenly be interrupted by dozens of brown shirts, often resulting in brutal beatings of attendees. The message was clear: supporting opposition parties came with physical risk, but Hitler was clever enough to maintain plausible deniability. While privately encouraging the violence, he publicly presented himself as a law and order candidate, someone who could end the very chaos his supporters were creating. This dual strategy, creating fear while promising security, proved remarkably effective in a Germany still reeling from World War I and economic depression. And here's what many don't realize: Hitler came to power legally. He wasn't elected outright as chancellor. He was appointed by President Hindenburg in January 1933, after a series of failed governments. At the time, many conservatives believed they could control Hitler by surrounding him with traditional cabinet members. They were catastrophically wrong. 4 weeks after Hitler became chancellor, on February 27, 1933, the German parliament building, the Reichstag, erupted in flames. The timing couldn't have been more convenient for Hitler's ambitions. Elections were scheduled just 6 days later, and the Nazi Party had been struggling to secure an absolute majority. Within hours of the fire, a young Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe was arrested at the scene. For Hitler, this was a political gift, immediate proof that communists were plotting to overthrow the government. What many historians now believe, however, is that the fire was either set by the Nazis themselves or, at minimum, exploited opportunistically by them. Regardless of who lit the match, Hitler's response was immediate and devastating. The very next day, Hitler persuaded President Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree, suspending civil liberties indefinitely. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to assembly, all vanished overnight. Police could search homes without warrants and confiscate property at will. Most critically, the decree allowed for the indefinite detention of anyone deemed to be a political threat. Within 24 hours, thousands of Communist Party leaders and officials were arrested. The timing was no coincidence. With the Communist Party effectively decapitated just days before the election, Hitler had eliminated his most powerful political rival in one swift move. But the true masterwork of political elimination was still to come. In March 1933, with communist representatives either arrested or in hiding, Hitler presented the enabling act to what remained of the Reichstag. This seemingly bureaucratic piece of legislation would prove to be democracy's death warrant in Germany. The act would grant Hitler's cabinet the power to enact laws without the involvement of the Reichstag for 4 years. In essence, it would transform Germany from a democracy into a legal dictatorship with a single vote. To ensure its passage, the Nazi Party surrounded the parliament building with SA and SS troops. The message to the remaining representatives was unmistakable: vote against Hitler at your peril. Even with these intimidation tactics, Hitler needed a 2/3 majority. The Center Party, a Catholic conservative group, held the deciding votes. Their leader, Ludwig Kaas, ultimately led his party to support the act after receiving vague promises about protecting church rights. With the Enabling Act passed, Hitler could now rule by decree. He had achieved a dictator's ultimate goal. His tyranny was now perfectly legal. No further elections would be needed. No legislation could be challenged in court. The remaining political parties must have sensed what was coming next. By summer 1933, Hitler moved against all remaining political parties. The Social Democratic Party was banned in June. By July, the Center Party dissolved itself under pressure. Other smaller parties followed suit. By July 14, 1933, less than 6 months after Hitler became chancellor, Germany was officially a one-party state. The Nazi Party was now the only legal political organization in the country, but outlawing parties was just the beginning. Hitler needed to ensure that no opposition could reorganize or operate underground. This meant targeting individual political figures with a terrifying thoroughness. Social Democrats and Communists faced the harshest treatment. Thousands were sent to newly established concentration camps at Dachau and elsewhere. These weren't yet the death camps of the Holocaust, but they were brutally effective at removing political opposition from public life. Even those who escaped Germany weren't safe. Nazi intelligence tracked down political exiles across Europe. In one notorious case, prominent anti-Nazi writer Theodor Lessing was tracked to Czechoslovakia, where he was attacked and fatally wounded by Nazi agents in August 1933. Let's pause here to consider the breathtaking speed of these events. In January 1933, Germany was a democracy with multiple political parties. By August, it was a one-party state where opposing Hitler meant imprisonment, or worse, and we're just getting started. By 1934, Hitler had eliminated organized external opposition, but he still faced challenges from within his own movement, particularly from the SA leadership under Ernst Röhm. The SA had been essential to Hitler's rise to power. With over 3 million members, it dwarfed the regular German army. Röhm had been one of Hitler's earliest supporters and closest allies, but he had become a liability for several reasons. First, Röhm envisioned the SA as the core of a new German military, which alarmed the traditional army leadership whose support Hitler needed. Second, Röhm and many SA leaders advocated for a second revolution, one that would be more socialist in nature, threatening Hitler's alliances with industrialists and conservatives. Perhaps most dangerously, Röhm controlled a paramilitary force larger than the German army and had the loyalty of millions. For a paranoid leader like Hitler, this could not be tolerated. Hitler's solution was as decisive as it was brutal. On June 30th, 1934, a night that would become known as the Night of the Long Knives, SS units under Heinrich Himmler's command launched coordinated attacks against SA leadership. Röhm was arrested personally by Hitler. After refusing the opportunity to take his own life, he was executed in his cell the following day. The purge extended far beyond the SA leadership, however. Conservative critics like former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher and his wife were killed in their home. Former Bavarian Commissioner Gustav von Kahr, who had opposed Hitler's beer hall putsch in 1923, was found hacked to death in a swamp. The exact death toll remains unknown, with estimates ranging from 85 to several hundred. What's particularly notable is that Hitler didn't hide these actions. He boasted about them. In a speech to the Reichstag, he declared himself the supreme judge of the German people, claiming the legal right to eliminate anyone he deemed a threat to national security. The German legal establishment, already compromised, retroactively legalized the purge with a one-paragraph decree. The Night of the Long Knives sent a chilling message. Not even being Hitler's longtime ally provided protection. Absolute loyalty was the only currency that mattered in the Third Reich. With legal opposition eliminated and internal rivals purged, Hitler's regime established a more permanent solution for political dissidents: the concentration camp system. Dachau, established in March 1933, became the model. Initially created to hold political prisoners, the early concentration camps weren't designed as extermination centers, but as detention facilities where political opponents could be isolated from society and subjected to re-education through forced labor and systematic brutality. The conditions were deliberately harsh. Prisoners were subjected to arbitrary punishment, inadequate nutrition, and backbreaking labor. Many did not survive the experience. Those who did were often broken in body and spirit. What many don't realize is that years before Jews, Roma, and other groups were targeted for mass destruction, political prisoners wore their own colored triangles in the camps. Communists and Social Democrats wore red triangles. Other political prisoners wore red triangles inverted to form a simple P. By 1939, tens of thousands of political prisoners had passed through the camp system. Many never returned. Those who survived and were eventually released served another purpose. They carried the terrifying reality of the camps back to their communities, spreading fear that silenced further dissent. The message was clear: oppose Hitler, even privately, and you might disappear into this system of deliberate cruelty. In 1934, Hitler established a new legal entity that would become synonymous with political persecution: the People's Court, Volksgerichtshof. Created specifically to try cases of political offenses, the People's Court operated outside normal legal constraints. Defendants had limited access to legal representation. Evidence obtained through coercion was admissible, and the judges were selected specifically for their Nazi loyalty rather than legal expertise. The most infamous judge, Roland Freisler, who presided over the court during its most active period, was known for his shouting tirades against defendants and predetermined guilty verdicts. Between 1934 and 1945, the People's Court handed down more than 16,000 death sentences, not just to active resistors, but to anyone who expressed doubt about Nazi leadership or policies. Even telling a political joke could lead to a death sentence if it was deemed to undermine military morale. Consider the case of Otto and Elise Hampel, a working-class couple who began leaving handwritten postcards around Berlin, urging resistance after Elise's brother was killed in France. For this minimal act of defiance, simply placing cards in public places questioning the war, they were tried before the People's Court, sentenced to death, and beheaded. The psychological impact of the People's Court extended far beyond those who actually faced trial. Germans knew that neighbors, colleagues, or even family members might report any careless political comment. This created a society of self-censorship, where political dissent vanished not just from public discourse, but from private conversation as well. By 1944, with Germany facing likely defeat, a group of military officers and civil servants launched the most serious attempt to remove Hitler from power. Led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, the conspirators planned to assassinate Hitler, take control of the government, and seek peace with the Allies. The July 20th plot wasn't a spontaneous act of desperation. It represented the culmination of years of growing disillusionment within the German military leadership and civil service. Many of the conspirators had been part of earlier, aborted plots. Some had been horrified by the atrocities they'd witnessed on the Eastern Front. Others recognized that Hitler was leading Germany to total destruction and sought to salvage what remained of their country before it was too late. What's particularly notable about the July 20th conspirators is that many had initially supported Hitler. Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben had been a Nazi sympathizer. General Ludwig Beck had helped Hitler rebuild the German army. Their evolution from supporters to active resistors illustrates how dramatically Hitler's leadership had alienated even those who once believed in him. On that fateful Thursday afternoon, Stauffenberg arrived at Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia for a military briefing. He carried a briefcase containing a British-made plastic explosive equipped with a silent time fuse. After activating the bomb, Stauffenberg placed the briefcase under the conference table, positioning it as close to Hitler as possible. Stauffenberg then excused himself, claiming he needed to make an urgent phone call. Minutes later, at approximately 12:42 p.m., the bomb detonated. The blast destroyed the conference room, killing 4 people and injuring many others. But through what some might call a tragic twist of fate, Hitler survived with only minor injuries. Someone had inadvertently moved the briefcase to the other side of a heavy oak table support, which shielded Hitler from the full force of the explosion. Unaware that Hitler had survived, Stauffenberg witnessed the explosion from a distance and immediately flew back to Berlin to implement Operation Valkyrie, the coup's second phase. For a few critical hours, the conspirators believed they had succeeded. They began issuing orders to arrest SS leaders and seize control of government buildings in Berlin. But by evening, news of Hitler's survival had reached Berlin. With their central premise, Hitler's death, now invalidated, the coup rapidly unraveled. Loyal Nazi forces quickly regained control. Stauffenberg and several key conspirators were arrested at the War Ministry and executed by firing squad in the courtyard that very night under the headlights of military vehicles. Had the conspirators succeeded, history might have taken a dramatically different course. They planned to immediately seek peace with the Western Allies while continuing to fight the Soviet Union, potentially avoiding the total defeat and division of Germany that followed Hitler's fall the next year. Hitler's vengeance for this betrayal went beyond anything previously seen in the Third Reich. In the following months, nearly 5,000 Germans were executed in connection with the plot. The Gestapo used the conspiratorial network as a pretext to arrest anyone with even tenuous opposition connections. The show trials that followed were particularly grotesque spectacles of vengeance. Presided over by the fanatical Roland Freisler in the People's Court, defendants were denied belts and suspenders, so they would have to hold up their pants while standing before the court, a deliberate humiliation. Freisler would scream insults at the accused, calling them traitors and cowards, while allowing no meaningful defense. The trial of prominent conspirators was filmed for Hitler's personal viewing. In the footage, Freisler can be seen berating distinguished military officers and diplomats as they stand stoically facing certain death. One of the most dignified was Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, who, despite being forced to hold his pants up and enduring Freisler's tirade, maintained his composure throughout the mockery of justice. The method of execution ordered by Hitler revealed his unquenchable thirst for revenge. Conspirators weren't simply shot, or even given the relative dignity of the guillotine. Instead, they were hung from meat hooks with piano wire, a method deliberately chosen to prolong their suffering. The executions were filmed at Hitler's request, providing him with footage he reportedly watched repeatedly. Their families didn't escape punishment either. Under a policy known as Sippenhaft, kin liability, relatives of conspirators, including children, were arrested and sent to concentration camps. The wife, children, and even extended family members of Stauffenberg were taken into clan arrest. His older children were forced to change their surname. Even infants were seized and placed in orphanages under new identities. What made the July 20th plot particularly significant was that it demonstrated Hitler's paranoia had reached new heights. In its aftermath, military officers were required to give the Nazi salute rather than the traditional military salute, a symbolic demonstration that loyalty to Hitler personally superseded all other allegiances. The military conspiracy also gave Hitler the pretext to purge the officer corps of anyone suspected of lacking absolute loyalty, replacing competent leadership with Nazi ideologues at a time when Germany faced imminent military defeat. The aftermath of the plot revealed the true nature of Hitler's regime in its final phase, a paranoid tyranny held together solely by fear and violence, willing to consume even its own military leadership rather than tolerate any challenge to Hitler's absolute authority. By targeting the military leadership so brutally, Hitler effectively decapitated Germany's last remaining institutional power center that might have acted as a check on his authority. As we've seen, Hitler's elimination of political opposition followed a clear pattern, one that began with intimidation, progressed to legal persecution, and culminated in physical elimination. Each step was calculated to remove barriers to absolute power while maintaining a veneer of legality. The effectiveness of these methods was undeniable. By 1939, organized political opposition inside Germany had been virtually eliminated. Individual acts of resistance continued, the White Rose student group distributing leaflets, churchmen like Martin Niemöller speaking out, workers staging small acts of sabotage, but coordinated resistance was almost impossible. This systematic destruction of opposing voices, the country that had been a center of philosophical debate, political diversity, and intellectual freedom, became a monolithic state where conformity was the only safe option. Universities that had pioneered critical thinking became propaganda centers. Newspapers that had represented diverse viewpoints became mere mouthpieces for state ideology. The human cost of this transformation can be measured not just in those directly eliminated, but in the millions whose talents, ideas, and contributions were suppressed by fear. How many innovations, artistic creations, and scientific advancements were lost because their creators feared expressing any thought that might deviate from approved ideology? Perhaps most disturbing is how many ordinary citizens became complicit in maintaining this system. The Nazi regime created elaborate reward systems for informants. Denouncing a neighbor as politically unreliable could result in tangible benefits. Perhaps their apartment or job would become available. This mercenary aspect of political persecution created a society where ethical considerations were subordinated to personal advantage. For those who resisted, despite the risks, the consequences were severe. Consider the case of Sophie Scholl and the White Rose Resistance Group, university students who distributed anti-Nazi leaflets in 1942 to 43. When caught, they faced Freisler's People's Court and were executed within days of their arrest. Sophie was was just 21 years old. Her last words before beheading were reportedly, "Such a fine, sunny day and I have to go. What does my death matter if through us, thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action?" The story of the White Rose reminds us that even in the darkest periods, some individuals maintain their moral compass. Despite creating one of history's most effective systems of repression, the Nazi regime never completely eliminated dissent. Small acts of resistance continued throughout the Third Reich. Workers slowing production, clergy giving sermons with veiled criticism, neighbors hiding those at risk. The speed with which this happened remains perhaps the most disturbing aspect. Germany transformed from a flawed but functioning democracy to a one-party dictatorship in less than 2 years. Political plurality, free press, independent courts, all vanished with a rapidity that shocked even contemporary observers. This historical lesson teaches us that democracy's guardrails can fail quickly when systematically attacked. Constitutional protections mean little without individuals willing to defend them. In the Nazi case, too many potential defenders calculated their personal interests rather than standing on principle. By the time the full threat was evident, organized resistance had become nearly impossible. Modern scholars debate whether contemporary democracies have sufficient safeguards against similar authoritarian tactics. While constitutional structures differ, human psychology remains constant. The same appeals to fear, the same willingness to trade liberty for security, the same vulnerability to demonization of others that Hitler exploited still exist in every society. The German experience under Hitler also demonstrates the danger of normalizing gradual erosions of democratic norms. Each step in Hitler's elimination of opposition, from the Reichstag fire decree to the Enabling Act to the Night of Long Knives, was justified as an exceptional measure responding to extraordinary circumstances. Each was presented as temporary, none were. Yet perhaps the most important lesson is that resistance, even when ultimately unsuccessful, matters profoundly. Those who opposed Hitler, from politicians who voted against the Enabling Act to the July 20th conspirators to ordinary Germans who helped their persecuted neighbors, maintained the possibility of a different Germany. Their actions, preserved in historical memory, provided moral foundations for the democratic society that emerged after 1945. When we study the systematic elimination of political opposition under Hitler, we're not just learning about historical events. We're gaining insights into the fragility of democratic institutions and the courage required to defend them. In doing so, we honor both the victims of Nazi persecution and those who risked everything to resist it. But Hitler's elimination of political rivals wasn't accomplished through violence alone. The Nazi propaganda apparatus, headed by Joseph Goebbels, played a crucial role in delegitimizing opposition before it was physically removed. One of Goebbels' first acts after the Nazis came to power was to establish the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Through this organization, he gained control over radio, press, cinema, and other forms of communication. Opposition politicians were portrayed not as legitimate alternatives, but as traitors working against German interests. Communist leaders were depicted as agents of Moscow. Social Democrats were blamed for Germany's defeat in World War I through the stab-in-the-back myth. Center-party politicians were characterized as puppets of Vatican influence. By controlling the narrative so completely, the Nazi regime ensured that when opposition leaders were arrested or worse, much of the public had already been conditioned to view them as enemies deserving punishment, rather than political figures expressing legitimate alternatives. This coupling of physical repression with propaganda manipulation created a particularly effective system for eliminating political resistance. Goebbels understood that effective propaganda required control of all information channels. Within months of Hitler's appointment as chancellor, the Nazi regime had either shut down or taken editorial control of approximately 175 newspapers. By 1939, the number of independent newspapers in Germany had decreased from over 4,700 to fewer than 1,000. All operating under strict censorship guidelines. Radio became a particularly powerful tool. Goebbels recognized its unique ability to reach millions simultaneously with the same message. The regime subsidized the production of affordable people's receivers, Volksempfänger, designed specifically to receive only domestic broadcasts. By 1939, over 70% of German households owned a radio, one of the highest rates in the world. These radios delivered a steady stream of propaganda into German homes. Political speeches, carefully crafted news reports, and entertainment programs all reinforce the same themes. The wisdom of Hitler's leadership, the threat posed by enemies both external and internal, and the necessity of national unity against these threats. The demonization of political opposition was a constant theme. Goebbels understood that eliminating rivals physically wasn't enough. Their ideas had to be discredited as well. Communist ideology wasn't presented as an alternative economic theory, but as a Jewish conspiracy to destroy German culture. Social democratic policies weren't debated on their merits, but portrayed as responsible for Germany's defeat in World War I and subsequent economic collapse. This propaganda barrage created a psychological environment where many Germans viewed the arrest of opposition leaders not as political persecution, but as necessary security measures against dangerous elements. When Ernst Thälmann, leader of the German Communist Party, was arrested in 1933, Nazi propaganda portrayed it not as the elimination of a political rival, but as the neutralization of a Moscow agent planning violent revolution. Film proved particularly effective for emotionally charged propaganda. Movies like The Eternal Jew and Hitler Junge Quecks didn't present rational arguments against political opposition, but triggered visceral emotional responses. The latter film portrayed communists as murderers of innocent Hitler Youth members, further cementing the association between political opposition and criminality. Particularly insidious was how Nazi propaganda exploited real historical traumas. Germany's defeat in World War I and the economic hardships that followed created genuine grievances that Goebbels masterfully redirected toward political scapegoats. Once these opposition groups were thoroughly demonized in public consciousness, their physical elimination met with significantly less resistance than it might have otherwise. The effectiveness of this propaganda strategy reveals an important lesson. Attacks on democratic institutions often begin with attacks on shared truth. By controlling information and systematically delegitimizing alternative voices, authoritarian regimes can create an environment where oppressive measures seem justified or even necessary to many citizens. The elimination of Hitler's political rivals succeeded not just because of SA violence or Gestapo efficiency, but because propaganda had prepared the public to accept or even support these actions.